Every parent's worst nightmare is their child walking out the door and never coming back. For one family in Bullitt County, Kentucky, this nightmare became their reality when 17-year-old Jessica Dishon disappeared just steps from her own home. What followed was a tragic tale of heartbreak, false leads, and years of searching for answers. Welcome back to Chilling Fireside Stories. In today's episode, we're uncovering the tragic case of Jessica Dishon, a bright, kind-hearted teenager whose life was stolen in a moment of unimaginable cruelty. This case is a story of love, loss, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Before we get started, please be aware that this story contains details of violence and abduction that some viewers may find distressing. Viewer discretion is advised. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. Now let's begin. Jessica Dishon was born on May 2, 1982, in the small town of Shepherdsville, Kentucky. It was a quiet place where many residents were involved in farming and knew each other well. Jessica had two younger brothers, and from an early age, she helped her parents take care of her siblings while they worked. This made Jessica more independent, and her parents could always rely on her. At 15, she took a part-time job at a local restaurant to save up for her first car. She dreamed of owning a red Pontiac, and a few years later, she had saved enough money to make that dream a reality. Despite working part-time, Jessica maintained excellent grades and had plans to attend college to become an accountant after high school. In the fall of 1999, when she was 17, Jessica started her senior year. She also began dating a boy, which excited her. On the morning of Friday, September 10th, Jessica's day began as usual. Her parents left for work while she was still asleep. Her younger brothers went to the bus stop and left for school. Jessica stayed home and was supposed to drive to school in her car soon after her brothers. Around noon, her mother returned home and immediately noticed something unusual. Jessica's car was parked in front of the house, even though she should have been in class at that time. The mother entered the house and went to Jessica's room, thinking she might have overslept. But Jessica wasn't in her bedroom. Next, the mother thought Jessica might have asked her father for a ride to school. She called him, but he said he had gone to work alone that morning. Concerned there might be something wrong with Jessica's car, the mother took a spare key to try starting it. However, as soon as she approached the car, she saw a disturbing scene. The driver's door was slightly open, and Jessica's cell phone lay on the seat with the numbers 9 and 1 on the screen. Beneath the front seat lay one of Jessica's shoes and her keys, and in the back seat were her textbooks, work clothes, and purse. Her mother immediately feared the worst. It was evident someone had tried to dial 911 on Jessica's phone but didn't finish. Moreover, Jessica obviously couldn't have just left all her belongings in the car and walked away. The family lived on the outskirts of town, so she would have had to walk several miles along the road on foot. Jessica's parents called the school only to learn that their daughter hadn't attended class. Somehow, the school had failed to notify them about this as it should have. A few hours later, Jessica's best friend from the restaurant where they both worked called her parents, saying that Jessica hadn't shown up for her shift, increasing their concern. Worried about Jessica's absence from school and work and the fact that her belongings, including a phone with 9 and 1 dialed, were left in an unlocked car, her parents decided to call the police. However, the sheriff simply suggested that Jessica likely wandered off and would return home eventually. He didn't pay any attention to the fact that one of her shoes was left in the car, making it difficult for her to go far without it. Jessica's parents tried to convince the sheriff that their daughter might be in danger, but despite their pleas, he refused to open an investigation, leaving them with no choice but to return home. After that, Jessica's parents decided to take matters into their own hands. They contacted relatives, friends, and acquaintances, but no one had seen her. Together, they started to search for Jessica throughout the town, but she was nowhere to be found. The next morning, her parents went back to the sheriff and told him that Jessica still hadn't made it home. This time, he dispatched 2 officers to inspect her car, but their parents faced yet another problem. The officers examined the vehicle without gloves, touching everything inside with their bare hands. They also didn't check Jessica's room, although it was standard procedure. Once again let down by law enforcement, Jessica's parents tried to get some help from the local media, drawing attention to their daughter's disappearance and the police's lack of interest. Alongside relatives and friends, they initiated their own search and also began distributing flyers with information about Jessica. The search was led by Jessica's father and his brother Stanley, who knew the area well. Fearing the worst, they decided to search the vicinity near a local river. The area had a bad reputation as it was popular among local drug dealers and other criminals due to its overgrown and secluded nature. For hours, Jessica's relatives combed through the difficult terrain near the river but found no trace of her. Just to point out that Stanley, Jessica's uncle, suddenly felt sick too, and they left the area with no result. The next morning, something extremely strange happened. Jessica's parents were at home and their son was playing in the yard. Suddenly, he rushed inside, claiming he heard a cry for help that sounded like his sister's voice. Jessica's father grabbed his shotgun and rushed outside, trying to locate the source of the cry. At the same time, his brother Stanley drove up to their house and quickly joined the search. Soon they noticed something. There was smoke rising from their neighbor's property, a 40-year-old man named David Brooks. As they approached, they saw him burning something that resembled clothing on his land. It looked highly suspicious, so Jessica's father asked Brooks for permission to search his farm. Brooks, however, refused and asked them to leave. This wasn't the only strange thing about Brooks. Before Jessica's disappearance, her relatives had maintained a normal relationship with him and his family. However, shortly after that, Brooks began behaving oddly. He started regularly driving slowly past their home, staring at them with an ominous smile. Jessica's parents also received mysterious phone calls where an unknown man remained silent and just breathed heavily. They suspected Brooks was behind it but couldn't understand the reason for such behavior. After witnessing Brooks burning clothing on his property, Jessica's parents decided to once again speak to the police, who had shown little interest in the case from the beginning. They shared their observations, asking officers to visit Brooks with cadaver dogs, and they agreed. Using Jessica's clothes to track her, the dogs led them to the fire pit on Brooks's property, but no substantial evidence was found. The dogs also discovered black gloves in one of the sheds, signaling the presence of a smell associated with decomposition. Throughout the search, Brooks displayed increasingly suspicious behavior, yet the police failed to connect him to Jessica's disappearance, once again leaving empty-handed. Disappointed by the police, Jessica's father decided to reach out to the FBI. The Bureau usually refrains from initiating investigations based solely on calls from the relatives of missing persons, but this time they decided to get involved immediately in light of the disturbing facts presented by Jessica's parents. After thorough research, the FBI concluded that something truly horrific might have happened to her. From this point on, a real investigation began, one that local cops had been reluctant to conduct. FBI agents collected fingerprints from Jessica's room and her car. They also seized all potential evidence for analysis and sent it all to the lab. Investigators organized an extensive search on the ground using helicopters and gathering volunteers. They thoroughly examined the bottom of the pond near Jessica's home, considering the possibility that her body might be there. FBI agents meticulously combed through Brooks's farm and found something very alarming in one of the sheds: a printed photo of Jessica. After this disturbing discovery, detectives were almost certain that Brooks was somehow involved in her disappearance. They also suspected his 35-year-old brother Joseph, as he behaved strangely while the police were searching his property. However, there was a problem. During the search, investigators found no evidence substantial enough to arrest the brothers, so they focused all their efforts on the search in the area, almost certain that Jessica was no longer alive. On September 27, 17 days after her disappearance, the police received a call. A woman was driving along the road near the river where Jessica's father had searched for her in the initial days. She saw something strange near a tree just off the road and decided to inspect it. The woman came closer, realized it resembled a human body, and called the police right away. After the discovery of the body, the FBI decided to re-interview Brooks, and this time they found out something new. During their initial conversation, he claimed to have seen Jessica near her house on the morning she vanished. However, this time he changed his story, stating that he hadn't seen her at all that day. Now he claimed he was at home in bed with his wife that morning, and when detectives questioned his wife, she contradicted her husband's testimony. The FBI continued to question Brooks, asking him what he would do if they found his fingerprints on the victim's body. Although there was no such evidence found, Brooks's response was extremely suspicious. He said he would have to confess to everything in that case. Later, he failed a polygraph test, so the FBI decided to arrest him and move forward with the trial. They were aware that the chances of a guilty verdict were relatively low, as they hadn't found any solid evidence linking Brooks to the murder. All they had were disturbing but indirect indications of his involvement. The detectives continued working on the case, searching for any additional evidence. As the trial preparations unfolded, investigators recalled another interesting detail. During the search of Brooks's car, they found a rope similar to the one used to tie the victim's legs. However, no DNA samples were found on it, making it another piece of circumstantial evidence. The trial began in January 2003. Brooks's lawyer insisted on the complete absence of evidence and declared his client's innocence. Something else came to light during the trial. When the body was discovered, investigators also found some missing limbs of the victim nearby. They placed them in special containers and handed them over to the local police, ignoring labels that said to store them in the refrigerator. They left the boxes at room temperature, causing extensive decomposition. So even if there was some potential evidence, including possible DNA traces from the killer, it was lost due to this error. All other circumstantial pieces of evidence against Brooks lacked sufficient weight. Ultimately, the jurors couldn't reach a unanimous decision, so the man walked free. According to state laws, he could only be charged again if new evidence was found. For Jessica's parents, this was a devastating blow. They had almost no doubt that Brooks was behind their daughter's murder. Moreover, had the police taken their job more seriously, their daughter might have been saved. So in the end, they lost all hope of achieving justice. In the following years, this case remained unsolved and was eventually almost entirely abandoned. In 2012, a new detective, Lynn Hunt, joined the local police department. She was assigned to investigate unsolved cases, and her initial focus fell on the murder of Jessica Dishon. Upon reviewing the case files, she was shocked by the negligence of her predecessors. Most of the documents were filled with errors, missing any reference to conversations with the involved parties, and the evidence wasn't properly documented. In other words, it was so ineffectively handled that she had to essentially start the investigation from scratch, 13 years after the murder. Her first step was to speak with Jessica's family. One of her brothers, now an adult living separately from his parents, handed her a box of Jessica's belongings from her car. He had kept it since the police returned these items to the family. Once again, Hunt was astonished at how carelessly her colleagues had handled the evidence, failing to store it properly according to protocol. Now, after so many years, these items were unlikely to help her, yet she diligently continued to examine everything she could find. Soon, she discovered an interesting detail among the documents: Brooks's medical examination report. It stated that his IQ was only 61, which is quite low. This raised concerns about all police actions, including Brooks's interrogations. Given his significantly low IQ, he might not have fully understood most of the questions and could have given inadequate answers. All of this led Hunt to consider that the man might have no connection to the case at all, as his weird behavior could easily be explained by his extremely low IQ. Then Hunt began to think about who else could have committed this murder. She extensively researched everyone involved in the case or living nearby. This went on until September 2014, nearly 15 years after Jessica's death. A colleague from another department called Hunt to share intriguing information. An inmate from a Kentucky state prison claimed to know the real identity of Jessica Dishon's murderer. Hunt approached this lead with slight skepticism. Usually, when inmates wanted to share some information with the police, it ended in disappointment and wasted time. Many of them just imagined stories to secure early release or improve their conditions in prison. Still, she understood that she couldn't ignore this lead without verification. She went to the prison and met with the man who supposedly had the information. According to him, he shared a cell for some time with an individual convicted of child abuse, the same charge as his. On this common ground, the two became friends and exchanged details about their crimes occasionally. One day, the cellmate told him that among other things he had murdered Jessica Dishon. After that, the informant dropped a bombshell, giving the detective the name of this man, leaving her in shock. It was Stanley Dishon, Jessica's uncle, her father's brother. According to the informant, Stanley told him that he had sexually abused Jessica for several years while living in their home. He threatened to kill her or someone close to her if she ever talked about it. In the spring of 1999, when Jessica got a boyfriend, Stanley began to fear that sooner or later she might confess to him about the abuse by her own uncle. On the morning of September 10th, Stanley arrived at her home when Jessica was alone. She was outside getting into her car, having already loaded all her belongings. Stanley approached her and demanded that she break up with her boyfriend, but Jessica refused and threatened to expose him if he didn't leave her alone. He started threatening her and she reached for the phone, attempting to dial 911. Stanley tried to grab her, but Jessica broke free and ran into the house. The man followed her to her room, struck her, and bound her in her sheets before taking her to an abandoned shed not far from where her body would later be found. Stanley kept her alive there for several days, subjecting her to abuse and torture. Then he killed her, moved the body to a visible location near the road, and buried the sheets in the ground beneath the shed. He also mentioned that after the murder he removed some of the victim's limbs, hoping to mislead the police into thinking drug traffickers were involved. Detective Hunt realized that this information was never disclosed. Only Jessica's closest relatives knew about the missing limbs, so the informant couldn't have fabricated this detail. He also added that Stanley buried Jessica's shoe beneath a broken tree near the shed. Hunt decided to verify all this information about the buried evidence. Given the shortage of staff in the local police department, no one from there could help her, so she reached out to Jessica's brother and a few other relatives who agreed to participate in the search. She didn't tell them that Stanley might be the murderer, as she decided to find some evidence to support these shocking accusations first. On the first day of the search, they failed to uncover any clues. Under the pouring rain, they dug in the areas matching the informant's description, but it yielded no results. The next day, Jessica's brother and Hunt returned to the site. On the way, he pointed out an abandoned barn alongside the road. They headed there and started digging the soil inside, and almost immediately, there was a long-awaited breakthrough. They discovered a buried bedsheet. Hunt collected the evidence and hurried to Jessica's home. Throughout these years, her parents hadn't made any changes to her room. It remained exactly as it was on the day their daughter vanished. Thanks to this, Hunt was able to confirm that the found bedsheet was part of Jessica's bedding. It was absent from the bed, and the other linen shared the same pattern. Immediately after this discovery, Stanley was arrested and brought in for questioning. He refused to confess to the crime, although he appeared visibly shaken during the conversation with the detectives. Eventually, he was charged with murder and the case proceeded to court. Jessica's father couldn't believe that his own brother had committed such a heinous act against his daughter. He went through a phase of complete denial but eventually came to terms with this unbearable reality. Later, he recalled that in the early days of Jessica's disappearance, it was Stanley who suggested searching for the body near the river. However, during the search he suddenly felt sick and his brother drove him home. It turned out this happened just a few hundred yards from the barn where Jessica was located, suggesting that Stanley deliberately diverted them from finding her while she was still alive. During the preparation for the trial, Detective Hunt researched the suspect's past, trying to find some additional evidence. She already knew he had served time for assaulting another girl in their family, but Hunt soon discovered an even more disturbing fact. Several other women closely related to Stanley told the police that he had sexually abused them at a young age. The pattern was consistent. He would tell his relatives that he temporarily had nowhere to live and asked them to let him stay in their home for a while. When left alone with the girls, Stanley committed his vile deeds, using threats to silence them. Hearing all of these stories, the police concluded that Stanley had been doing this for 3 decades. Despite all of this, Detective Hunt realized that securing a conviction for the murder would be challenging since there were almost no direct pieces of evidence against Stanley, such as fingerprints or DNA. She continued to dig into the case until she stumbled upon a box of old files she hadn't examined yet. Looking through its contents, Hunt was once again shocked by the incompetence of her predecessors who initially handled the case. In the box, there was a letter dated June 26, 2002. Another informant wrote to the police the same story that Hunt heard only 12 years later from the Kentucky prison inmate. By the summer of 2002, Stanley was already serving time for assaulting an underage relative. During that time, he told his cellmate about murdering Jessica. The cellmate, who happened to be a police informant, wrote a letter to the department handling the case, disclosing all the gruesome details of what Stanley had done to his niece. And what did the police do? They simply ignored the letter, likely convinced of Brooks's involvement in those years, so they didn't bother considering other suspects. Once again, Hunt was disappointed by her colleagues' lack of professionalism. If only they had paid more attention to their job, this case could have been solved back in 2002. By now, after all these years, she could only await the trial, hoping that Stanley would finally face delayed justice for his actions. The process began in 2015 and Stanley declared his innocence. Present in the courtroom, Jessica's parents could hardly look at their relative who had destroyed their lives. They were also furious that he couldn't just confess to give them some sort of closure. The prosecution believed that the chances of obtaining a guilty verdict on murder charges were relatively low, mainly because there was almost no substantial evidence against him. There was also a problem with the assault charges involving other girls in the family. All of them would have to testify in court, describing Stanley's actions against them in great detail. So the prosecution decided to offer Stanley a plea deal. They agreed to drop the death penalty in exchange for Stanley's confession, both in assaults on relatives and Jessica's murder. In the end, he agreed and pleaded guilty. As part of the deal, he wasn't required to disclose any specific details of the crimes. Jessica's parents, who desired to know the whole truth, weren't happy about it, but Stanley remained silent. Under the plea deal terms, the murderer received a 20-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years. Given that he was 56 at the time of sentencing, Stanley might be released at 71. After the trial, Jessica's father promised that if his brother doesn't die in prison, he'll be waiting for him to take matters into his own hands. In 2019, Stanley gave his first interview, claiming he didn't kill Jessica. According to him, he was at work that morning, but it was impossible to verify after 2 decades. He also couldn't explain how 2 unrelated informants came up with identical stories, including details only known to the murderer, such as the bedsheet's burial site. As for David Brooks, detectives still don't rule out his potential minor involvement in the case. Stanley knew him and could have asked for help in disposing of the victim's belongings. Given Brooks's low IQ, he might not have fully understood the whole situation. It's possible that he burned the girl's clothes in the fire, and Stanley might have handed him the gloves with the scent of the body that the dogs detected. It's also possible that he left Jessica's photo in Stanley's shed to frame him. However, the truth may never be revealed, as Brooks passed away in 2021 due to heart problems. It's worth mentioning the moment when, on the 3rd day of Jessica's disappearance, her younger brother heard a cry for help outside, thinking it was his sister. It's still impossible to say with certainty what happened at that time. The girl could have still been alive, but Stanley was holding her in the barn a few miles away from her home, where he brother imagined it due to stress or someone else was screaming. But there's a somewhat unlikely version. Right after Jessica's father rushed outside, Stanley drove up to the house, which means he was nearby. It could be that the girl was in his car with her mouth taped shut or unconscious. Jessica Dishon's story is a stark reminder that danger can sometimes come from the places you least expect. Her death shattered her family, her community, and the innocence of a small Kentucky town. While justice was eventually served, no sentence could ever bring back the vibrant young woman whose life was stolen far too soon. Jessica's legacy lives on through the memories of those who loved her, and her story serves as a cautionary tale for all of us. When it comes to protecting children, the key lies in awareness, communication, and fostering a safe environment where they feel comfortable sharing. Here are some essential tips to keep your kids safe. Create a home environment where your children feel safe talking about anything, whether it's about school, friendships, or situations that make them uncomfortable. Emphasize that no topic is off limits and that they won't face judgment or punishment for sharing their thoughts or concerns. Remind them that they can always come to you or a trusted adult for help, no matter what. Explain to your children that, unfortunately, harmful situations can arise from anyone, even from people they know and trust, including family members or close family friends. Use age-appropriate language to describe inappropriate behaviors, such as touching, secrets, or actions that make them feel uneasy. Encourage them to trust their instincts and tell you or another trusted adult immediately if something feels wrong. Role-play potential situations with your children to help them recognize red flags. For example, what if someone you know asks you to keep a secret about something that makes you feel uncomfortable? Or what if someone you trust wants to show you something that feels strange? These conversations help prepare children to respond confidently and seek help. Teach your children about personal boundaries like body autonomy and let them know it's okay to say no, even to adults. Explain the concept of consent in simple terms, such as no one should touch you if you don't want them to, and no one should ever ask you to keep something like that a secret. As parents, it's difficult to imagine that someone we know or trust could harm our children, but staying vigilant and fostering an open relationship with them is crucial. By having these conversations early and consistently, you empower your child with the knowledge and confidence to protect themselves, while ensuring they know they have your unconditional support. Consider using apps like Life 360 to keep track of your children's whereabouts and maintain peace of mind. These tools can also help them quickly contact you in case of emergencies. While technology can't replace vigilance, it's an additional layer of protection in today's world. You can find the link in the description. If you found these tips helpful, share them with your friends and community to spread awareness. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Until my next video, stay informed, stay wham, and stay safe.